What did Joseph Goebbels actually do all day? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer is one of the most disturbing, fascinating, and instructive stories to emerge from the entire history of the Third Reich. Here was a man who never commanded an army, never flew a plane into battle, never designed a weapon or directed a prison camp. He had a clubfoot that kept him from military service and a physique so slight that soldiers openly mocked him behind his back. And yet, Joseph Goebbels may have been the single most dangerous person in Nazi Germany after Adolf Hitler himself. He was the architect of mass deception, the engineer of hatred, the man who took an entire civilized nation and rewired its collective mind. But how exactly did he do it? What were the mechanisms, the routines, the daily habits and obsessions that made him so terrifyingly effective? In this video, we are going to go inside a single day in the life of Joseph Goebbels, and then we are going to stretch that day across 12 years of Nazi rule to reveal the full scope of what he built, what he destroyed, and what he left behind. So, without further ado, let us start at the very beginning. Paul Joseph Goebbels was born on October 29, 1897, in Reit, a small industrial town in the Rhineland region of Western Germany. He was the third of 5 children born to Fritz Goebbels, a factory clerk, and Katharina Maria Odenhausen. The family was devoutly Catholic, working class and fiercely proud of its modest respectability. From the moment he could walk, Joseph Goebbels was aware that he was different. A childhood illness, most likely osteomyelitis, had left him with a deformed right foot, causing him to walk with a pronounced limp that would follow him for the rest of his life. In a culture that prized physical health and martial bearing, this was no small burden. The other children were brutal in the way that children can be, and young Joseph learned early on that if he could not compete physically, he would have to find other weapons. He found them in words. The boy who could not run could talk with an eloquence that left adults stunned and silenced his schoolyard tormentors, at least sometimes, with the sheer force of his arguments. His parents scraped together enough money to give him the education that his intelligence clearly demanded, and he moved through the German gymnasium system with remarkable academic distinction, eventually entering the University of Heidelberg in 1917. The timing of his university years was not incidental. Germany was bleeding to death on the Western Front, and the social order that had seemed fixed and permanent was beginning to crack at every seam. Goebbels studied literature, history, philosophy and classical philology, moving through no fewer than 8 German universities before finally receiving his doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1921, writing his thesis on a minor 19th-century playwright named Wilhelm von Schütz. It is worth pausing to consider this fact for a moment. The man who would go on to supervise the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus in human history up to that point began his career as a failed literary scholar with genuine intellectual pretensions. He loved the Romantic poets. He read Dostoevsky and wept over it. He wrote a novel, Michael, that he considered a serious work of literary fiction. He spent years trying and failing to get his creative writing published through conventional channels, and the rejection stung him in a way that he never truly got over. The frustrated artist and the merciless propagandist coexisted within Goebbels for his entire career, an understanding that tension is essential to understanding everything he did. After completing his doctorate, Goebbels found himself exactly where he feared most: nowhere. The Germany of the early 1920s offered no comfortable place for a Catholic, club-footed intellectual with far-left sympathies, a chip on his shoulder the size of the Rhineland, and a burning need for greatness. He worked briefly as a bank clerk, then as a journalist, and threw himself into the chaos of Weimar politics with the desperate energy of a man who knows that conventional paths are closed to him. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, in 1924, initially associating with the more socialist, anti-capitalist northern faction led by Gregor Strasser. But everything changed on November 6, 1925, when Goebbels first heard Adolf Hitler speak at a gathering in Brunswick. The experience was, by his own breathless account in his diaries, nothing less than a conversion. He wrote that Hitler was not only a political leader, but a genius, a force of nature, a man who could express in his raw, savage rhetoric everything that Goebbels himself felt but had never been able to say with quite the same devastating simplicity. Within months, he had completely transferred his loyalty from Strasser to Hitler, writing in his diary in April 1926 the words that would effectively define the rest of his life. Adolf Hitler, I love you. Hitler, for his part, recognized immediately what he had in Goebbels. Here was a man with a genuine doctoral degree and a first-rate mind who was also willing to do absolutely anything to subordinate every shred of intellectual integrity to the service of the movement. Hitler appointed him Gauleiter, or regional party leader of Berlin, in 1926. The city was a stronghold of the Communist Party and the Social Democrats, hostile territory for the Nazis, and Hitler sent Goebbels there with almost no resources and an instruction that amounted to, make us famous. What Goebbels did with that assignment revealed his genius in the most chilling possible way. He immediately understood that in a city saturated with political messaging, the only way to break through the noise was not to shout louder, but to be more provocative, more theatrical, and more shameless than anyone else. He organized rallies that he knew would end in street fights because street fights got coverage. He published a newspaper, Der Angriff, meaning the attack, that was so outrageously insulting to opponents that it generated constant legal threats, which in turn generated more coverage. He was arrested and prosecuted multiple times for incitement, and each prosecution made him more famous. He had understood years before the term would exist that there was no such thing as bad publicity. By the time the Nazis came to power nationally in January 1933, Goebbels had turned a marginal fringe movement into the dominant political force in the world's most culturally sophisticated city. On March 13, 1933, Adolf Hitler appointed Joseph Goebbels as Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, a position that had never existed before in the German government. The title itself was a masterpiece of doublespeak, public enlightenment. The phrase implied that ordinary Germans were not yet enlightened, that they were sitting in darkness, and that it was the ministry's benevolent function to bring them light. What the ministry actually did was the precise opposite. It systematically extinguished every independent source of information in Germany and replaced it with a single, controlled narrative that served the interests of the Nazi state. Goebbels moved into the offices of the new ministry on Wilhelmplatz in Berlin with the energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He was 35 years old. He had been given command of an empire. So what did a typical day look like for the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda? The answer is both more mundane and more monstrous than most people expect. Let us walk through it. Goebbels was not a particularly early riser by the standards of the Nazi leadership, most of whom tended toward the nocturnal habits of their Führer. He would typically wake between 8 and 9 in the morning at his private residence, which after 1936 was a vast lakeside property at Bodensee, about 30 kilometers northeast of Berlin, on a secluded estate that the city of Berlin had given him as a gift. The property would eventually grow to include a substantial main house designed by the architect Karl Reichler, a cinema screening room, guest cottages, and extensive grounds. Before the Bodensee estate was ready, he lived in an elegant villa on the Reichskanzlerplatz in Berlin. By any measure, the man who had grown up in a modest working-class household in Reit was now living in a degree of luxury that would have been unimaginable to his parents. His morning routine began with a review of the overnight reports. While Goebbels slept, the machinery of his ministry never stopped. Across Germany and eventually across occupied Europe, agents and monitors were watching, listening, and reading everything that moved through the public information space. By the time the minister sat down for his morning coffee, he had in front of him a comprehensive summary of what the German press had published that morning, what the foreign press was saying about Germany, what the BBC and other enemy broadcasters had aired overnight, what the mood in various German cities was reported to be, and what problems or opportunities required his immediate attention. This intelligence-gathering operation was one of the most important and least discussed aspects of Goebbels' regime. He was not simply broadcasting propaganda outward, he was simultaneously conducting a continuous, sophisticated survey of public opinion, adjusting his messaging in response to what people were actually thinking and saying and feeling. He was, in modern terms, running the most advanced focus group operation in the world, and he updated his product constantly based on the feedback. After reviewing the overnight reports, Goebbels would typically meet with his senior staff, including the state secretaries and department heads who ran the various divisions of his enormous ministry. The Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was organized into departments covering the press, radio, film, theatre, music, fine arts, literature, and later special departments for tourism, foreign propaganda, and what was delicately termed active propaganda in occupied territories. Each department head arrived with reports, proposals, and problems, and Goebbels would move through them with the brisk efficiency of a man who genuinely enjoyed management. He had a memory that colleagues described as almost frightening in its precision. He could recall specific newspaper articles, radio broadcasts, and film scenes that he had reviewed weeks or months earlier, and would reference them in meetings with an exactitude that kept his subordinates permanently on edge. You never knew what detail he would seize upon, which oversight would bring his sarcastic wrath down upon your head. The centerpiece of Goebbels' working day was an institution that he established almost immediately upon taking office and maintained with remarkable consistency for 12 years. The daily ministerial conference. Every morning, usually around 11 o'clock, the senior editors and journalists of every major German newspaper, wire service, and news agency were summoned to the ministry, or received written directives called Tagesparolen, meaning daily watchwords that told them precisely what to report, how to report it, which stories to emphasize, which to downplay, which to ignore entirely, and even, in many cases, exactly how headlines should be worded. This was not guidance. It was instruction. A German newspaper editor who deviated significantly from the Tagesparolen did not receive a polite correction. He lost his job, and if he was particularly defiant, he might find himself in a concentration camp. Goebbels understood from the very beginning that a propaganda system built on fear of punishment was inherently fragile, because frightened people would obey the letter of instructions while sabotaging their spirit at every opportunity. So, alongside the coercive architecture of the system, he worked hard to create genuine believers, men and women who actually shared his vision and enforced it, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The daily press conference was remarkable, not just for what it produced, but for what it revealed about Goebbels' theory of information control. He believed and stated explicitly in his diaries and in various speeches to his staff that the most dangerous thing for any propaganda system was monotony. A population subjected to the same message, delivered in the same way day after day, would eventually tune it out. They would stop believing not because they had evidence that the propaganda was false, but simply because they were bored by its predictability. So Goebbels worked constantly to vary the presentation of his messages, to find new angles, new emotional hooks, new ways of making the same essential points feel fresh and urgent and personally relevant to ordinary German readers and listeners. He was, in the language of modern marketing, obsessed with engagement. And he was very, very good at it. By midday, Goebbels would often attend a working lunch, either at the ministry or at the Reich Chancellery, where he maintained one of the closest ongoing working relationships with Hitler of any senior Nazi official. The relationship between Hitler and Goebbels was genuinely complex, and understanding it is critical to understanding how the propaganda machine actually functioned. Goebbels did not simply receive instructions from Hitler and carry them out. The relationship was considerably more dynamic than that. Goebbels was one of the very few people in the Nazi leadership whom Hitler genuinely respected as an intellectual peer, and their conversations ranged widely across history, art, film, and philosophy, as well as current politics. Hitler trusted Goebbels' instincts about public opinion more than he trusted almost anyone else's, and Goebbels used that trust strategically to advance his own vision of what Germany's propaganda needed to say and to be. At the same time, Goebbels was absolutely clear-eyed about the nature of his relationship with Hitler. He was not a friend. He was a servant who happened to be more useful and more creative than the other servants. The diaries record dozens of moments where Goebbels felt slighted, overlooked, or displaced in Hitler's affections by rivals like Goering or Ribbentrop, and his response to these moments reveals the fundamental insecurity beneath the ferocious public confidence. After lunch, the afternoon was typically given over to what Goebbels considered the most important part of his work: direct engagement with the media products that his ministry supervised. He screened films. On average, according to various accounts in his own diary entries, Goebbels watched between 2 and 5 films per week throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. He watched German productions, foreign productions, American Hollywood films that were banned for the German public, but viewed by him and his inner circle as competitive benchmarks and sources of entertainment. He reviewed scripts. He met with directors, screenwriters, and actors. He attended theatre productions and opera performances. He visited exhibitions and reviewed artworks. He listened to radio broadcasts and reviewed scripts for upcoming programs. He read manuscripts submitted for publication and approved or rejected them with a thoroughness that left publishers and authors in no doubt about who held final authority over the cultural life of the nation. This afternoon, immersion in cultural product was not leisure, it was work. Goebbels believed with complete conviction that culture was not separate from politics, but was, in fact, the most powerful political instrument available to any modern state. He had read Plato and understood the philosopher's warning about the political power of art. He had studied the history of the French Revolution and absorbed the lesson that it was poets and pamphleteers, not generals, who had first made mass revolution thinkable. He had watched the Bolsheviks in Russia use film and theatre to transform a largely illiterate peasant population into a revolutionary mass, and he had decided that the Nazis could do it better. The German cultural tradition was the richest in the world. German music, German philosophy, German literature had shaped Western civilization for centuries. Goebbels intended to weaponize all of it, to harness the emotional power of Bach and Beethoven, Schiller and Goethe, German expressionist cinema and the classical theatrical tradition, and direct it toward the service of Adolf Hitler's vision of a racial empire. This was not a small ambition. The first step was establishing control, and Goebbels moved with extraordinary speed. Within weeks of taking office, he created the Reich Chamber of Culture, the Reichskulturkammer, by decree in September 1933. The structure was elegant in its totalitarian simplicity. The Reich Chamber of Culture was divided into 7 separate chambers covering film, radio, press, fine arts, music, theatre and literature. Every single person working in any of these fields in Germany was required by law to be a member of the relevant chamber. Membership required proof of racial purity under the Nazi definition, a politically clean record, and acceptance of the ministry's authority. Jews were immediately excluded from membership in any chamber. This single regulatory stroke effectively expelled every Jewish artist, writer, musician, actor, director, and journalist from legal cultural life in Germany. Without chamber membership, you could not publish, broadcast, perform, exhibit, or work in any creative capacity. You could not even give piano lessons. The legal, institutional mechanism for cultural exclusion was established before most Germans had fully registered what was happening. Goebbels ran the Reich Chamber of Culture with the same combination of ideological rigidity and pragmatic flexibility that characterized all his work. He believed in racial theory as a matter of genuine conviction, not merely as a political tool. He was, in this respect, a true believer. But he was also smart enough to understand that ideology alone could not produce the quality of cultural product that he needed to keep the German public engaged and entertained. He needed genuine talent, and genuine talent was sometimes inconvenient. There were brilliant German filmmakers whose politics were ambiguous or who had personal relationships with Jewish colleagues. There were musicians whose racial credentials were questionable, but whose performances were magnificent. There were actors who were popular with audiences, and therefore commercially important regardless of their private reservations about National Socialism. Goebbels navigated these contradictions with a politician's pragmatism, granting exceptions, looking the other way, and occasionally pulling strings to protect individuals he found personally useful or artistically essential, while maintaining the ideological framework of racial purity as an absolute principle for everyone else. One of the most illuminating examples of this pragmatism involved the film industry, which Goebbels loved above all other cultural forms. German cinema in the Weimar Republic had been one of the most creatively vibrant in the world, producing masterpieces like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, Metropolis, and The Blue Angel. The industry was deeply internationalized, with many of its most important creative figures having Jewish backgrounds or strong connections to Hollywood. When Goebbels arrived in March 1933 with his ministry freshly established, the film industry went through a convulsion of exodus and rearrangement. Directors Fritz Lang, Billy Wilder, and Robert Siodmak, actors Peter Lorre and Elizabeth Berner, the composer Friedrich Holländer, all left. The talent drain was enormous and in some respects never fully recovered, but Goebbels worked with what remained, and what remained was still considerable. He poured resources into the film industry, understanding that cinema was the most powerful mass medium of the age. German film production during the Nazi period was substantial. Approximately 1,000 feature films were produced between 1933 and 1945, though the majority were light entertainment comedies, romances, and musicals, rather than heavy propaganda pieces. Goebbels understood that if you fed people nothing but ideology, they would turn off. The propaganda had to be embedded in entertainment, not substituted for it. His own attendance at film screenings was not merely supervisory. He genuinely loved cinema with the passion of a man who had once dreamed of being an artist himself. His diaries are full of detailed, sometimes surprisingly perceptive film criticism. He admired Sergei Eisenstein's work, the great Soviet director, with a frankness that reveals the complex relationship between the Nazi propaganda machine and its ideological enemies. He was enthralled by American productions and particularly by the work of directors like Frank Capra and stars like Clark Gable and Gary Rogers. He screened Disney films and wept at their beauty. He maintained a private film library that included thousands of titles from around the world. For a man who was simultaneously presiding over one of history's great acts of cultural destruction, there was something almost poignant about the sophistication and breadth of his private cinematic taste. Almost. Then you remember what he did with it. The afternoons at the ministry also involved regular sessions with what Goebbels called his special projects, the major propaganda campaigns that he designed and supervised personally rather than delegating to subordinates. These ranged from the ongoing drumbeat of anti-Semitic messaging that ran through every corner of German public life to specific targeted campaigns designed to manage particular political moments. Goebbels was the operational mind behind the anti-Jewish boycott of April 1st, 1933, which he staged with theatrical precision, positioning uniformed SA men outside Jewish-owned businesses, with signs telling Germans not to buy from Jews, and photographing the scene to create the impression of a spontaneous popular uprising when it was in fact a carefully organized government action. He was the producer of the Nuremberg rallies, working with Albert Speer on the visual and symbolic architecture of those extraordinary events, understanding that the experience of 100,000 people massed under searchlights in a darkened field was producing not just political loyalty, but something closer to religious ecstasy. He ran the propaganda war during the Rhineland remilitarization in 1936, flooding German and international media with messaging that framed Hitler's breach of the Versailles Treaty as an act of national self-determination. He shaped the narrative of the Anschluss with Austria in March 1938, working the international press so effectively that many foreign correspondents initially reported the event as a peaceful reunion of German peoples, rather than the military annexation it actually was. By late afternoon, Goebbels would typically return to his residence for a period of correspondence and diary writing. This last item deserves particular attention because the diaries of Joseph Goebbels are one of the most extraordinary documents in modern history. He began keeping them in 1923 before he had joined the Nazi Party, and he continued them with near daily consistency until the final days of his life in April 1945, eventually filling over 70,000 pages of typescript. He dictated the diaries to secretaries as he grew more senior and too busy to write them by hand, but the voice in them remained unmistakably his. Self-congratulatory, paranoid, viciously funny, strategically self-serving, and occasionally, when he was tired or the war was going badly, startlingly honest. The diaries were not written for publication in his own lifetime, but he knew they would eventually be read and that awareness shaped them in complex ways. He was performing for posterity even in his most private moments, constructing a version of himself that was simultaneously heroic and victimized. A man of genius surrounded by mediocrities, a true believer betrayed by others' weakness. And yet, for all their self-serving qualities, the diaries are indispensable because they contain details about the day-to-day operations of the Nazi propaganda machine that appear nowhere else. Evenings for Goebbels were frequently social occasions with significant political dimensions. The Nazi leadership was, in many respects, a court, with all the intrigue, rivalry, and performance that courtly environments generate. Dinner at the Goebbels household or at official functions in Berlin was attended by film stars, artists, diplomats, foreign correspondents, and senior Nazi officials. Goebbels was one of the most socially skilled members of the leadership, capable of charming guests from across the political and cultural spectrum in a way that cruder figures like Goering or Himmler simply could not manage. He could discuss French literature with a Paris journalist, talk about Hollywood technique with a visiting American director, and debate ancient Greek philosophy with a professor, all in the same evening. This social versatility was not merely personal charm. It was functional. The dinner table was an intelligence-gathering operation. Every conversation with a foreign correspondent was an opportunity to plant a story. Every interaction with a German film star was a reminder of who held power over their career. The evenings also brought Goebbels face-to-face with one of the defining characteristics of his personal psychology, his almost predatory attitude toward women. He was notorious throughout the Nazi leadership and the Berlin cultural world for his voracious and largely unscrupulous pursuit of actresses, models, and other women who entered his orbit. He used the power of the Reich Chamber of Culture and his personal authority over the film industry as a mechanism for sexual access in a way that was understood by everyone involved, even if rarely spoken about aloud. Young actresses learned quickly that a relationship with the Reich minister was not exactly optional if they wanted career advancement, and that resisting his attention could have professional consequences. The extent of this systematic abuse of power was documented after the war in numerous accounts and is corroborated by the diaries themselves, which record his various relationships with a casualness that suggests he saw no reason to apply ethical scrutiny to his own behavior in this domain. The most famous and consequential of these relationships was his affair with the Czech actress Lida Barová, which began in 1936 and lasted until 1938, and came closer than anything else in his life to destroying him professionally. Barová was 23 when she met Goebbels, who was 38, and she was already a successful film actress with credits in both German and Czech productions. By all accounts, what began as another of the minister's casual seductions became something much more serious and much more dangerous. Goebbels fell genuinely, obsessively in love with her, and at some point in 1938 he apparently proposed to his wife Magda that they arrange a managed separation so that he could pursue a more permanent arrangement with Barová. Magda Goebbels, who was herself a formidable and complicated figure with her own complex relationship to Nazi ideology and to her husband's infidelities, went directly to Adolf Hitler. What followed was one of the most extraordinary private confrontations of the entire Nazi period. Hitler summoned Goebbels and informed him coldly and with absolute finality that the affair was over. Germany's chief propagandist could not be seen to be engaged in a public moral scandal. The ministry's entire messaging depended on projecting an image of the Nazi family as the model of healthy German domesticity, and a minister seeking a divorce to pursue an actress was incompatible with that message. Goebbels was devastated. He attempted to resign, an offer Hitler refused. He was forced to end the relationship with Barová, who was subsequently pressured to leave Germany and to publicly reconcile with Magda. He and Magda went on to have a sixth child, Haida, born in October 1940, the living symbol of their mandated reconciliation. The Barová affair did more than briefly destabilize Goebbels' marriage. It illuminated in a remarkably clear light the nature of the cage in which he lived. For all his power, for all the vast apparatus of control that he commanded, he was as subject to Hitler's absolute authority as any ordinary German citizen. His genius, his indispensability, his 12 years of fanatical service, none of it gave him the ability to conduct his personal life according to his own choices when those choices conflicted with Hitler's political calculations. This was the fundamental reality of life at the top of the Nazi system. You were powerful only insofar as Hitler found you useful, and you remained useful only insofar as you served his vision rather than your own desires. Goebbels absorbed this lesson and, characteristically, drew it back into his diary with bitter self-awareness. His relationship with Magda Goebbels was, in its own way, as significant to understanding him as his relationship with Hitler. Magda Behrendt-Quandt, as she had been before marrying him, was a woman of considerable intelligence and strong personality, whose path to National Socialism had been, if anything, even more ideologically motivated than her husband's. She had become a committed believer in Nazi ideology, largely independently of Goebbels, and Hitler regarded her with a warmth and admiration that was distinct from his more complex respect for her husband. Some historians have speculated, with varying degrees of credibility, about the nature of Hitler's personal feelings toward Magda Goebbels. What is not in doubt is that the family of Joseph and Magda Goebbels, with their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig and Heide, all names beginning with the letter H in honor of Adolf Hitler, served as the Third Reich's model family. They appeared on magazine covers. They were photographed at family celebrations and holidays. Magda was held up as the ideal German mother, devoted, beautiful, racially pure, and fecund. It was one of the most sustained and deliberate acts of personal branding in the history of politics, and it was entirely constructed by the man who ran Germany's propaganda ministry and understood better than anyone the gap between public image and private reality. Now let us turn to perhaps the most powerful single instrument in Joseph Goebbels' arsenal, the one that he himself considered the most transformative of all the tools available to a modern propagandist. Before film, before the press, before theatre or art or music, there was radio. And in radio, Goebbels found something that no previous propagandist in history had possessed: the ability to speak simultaneously to every person in an entire nation, in the privacy of their own homes, in the voice of a single state-controlled message. The implications of this were, in 1933, still not fully understood by most governments in the world. Radio was relatively new. Most countries treated it as a cultural luxury, a medium for entertainment and educational programming. Goebbels understood it as a weapon of mass political persuasion with almost unlimited range and power, and he moved to seize control of German broadcasting with the same methodical urgency he brought to every other medium. Control of German radio had been partially centralized in the Weimar Republic under the Reich Radio Company, but there remained considerable regional variation and genuine editorial independence in the system when Goebbels took over in March 1933. Within weeks, he had used the ministry's authority to bring all broadcasting under direct centralized control. Regional broadcasting companies were dissolved or absorbed. Independent programming decisions were eliminated. Every radio broadcast in Germany, from morning news bulletins to afternoon music programs to evening political speeches, was subject to the ministry's editorial authority. This was the infrastructure. But Goebbels understood that infrastructure was useless if people did not have radios to receive the broadcasts, and in 1933 radio ownership in Germany was still limited by cost. Only a relatively affluent minority of German households had receivers. His solution was the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, launched in August 1933. The Volksempfänger was a stripped-down, technically simple radio receiver designed specifically for mass affordability. Produced in enormous quantities by a consortium of German electronics manufacturers working under ministry direction, the standard model retailed for 76 Reichsmarks, the equivalent of roughly 1 to 2 weeks' wages for an average German worker. Later models, including the Deutsche Kleinempfänger or German small receiver, came down to as little as 35 Reichsmarks. The government actively subsidized workplace receivers, placing them in factories, offices, restaurants, and public spaces, so that even those who could not afford a personal set would be reached by broadcasts. By 1939, Germany had approximately 70% household radio penetration, one of the highest rates in the world. Goebbels had transformed radio from an elite entertainment medium into a genuine mass medium in less than 6 years, and every single one of those radios was, in effect, a loudspeaker for his ministry. What did Germans actually hear when they tuned in? The answer is more sophisticated than simple political haranguing, though there was certainly plenty of that. Goebbels understood that if radio became associated exclusively with political speeches and ideology, people would find reasons not to listen. Entertainment was essential, and the Nazi radio schedule was genuinely entertaining by the standards of the time. Music programs were enormously popular and received enormous resources. Light classical music, folk music, and popular dance music dominated the schedule. Variety shows, comedy programs, sporting coverage, and dramatic productions all filled significant airtime. The political and ideological content was embedded within this entertainment context, appearing regularly but not so frequently as to alienate the audience. When Hitler gave a speech, an event that was broadcast live across all channels, the preceding programming would typically build emotional momentum through musical choices selected specifically to prime the listener for the political content that followed. When major propaganda campaigns were underway, the general entertainment schedule would be subtly adjusted to reinforce the key messages, with themes, songs, and storylines that echoed the ministry's current priorities, often without listeners consciously registering the connection. The special broadcasts that Goebbels organized for specific occasions were masterpieces of emotional manipulation. The rebroadcast of the Nuremberg rallies, carefully edited to maximize dramatic impact, brought the experience of those enormous gatherings into every German living room and workplace. Broadcasts of sporting victories, particularly during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, were choreographed to generate maximum nationalist emotion when German troops entered the Rhineland in March 1936. Goebbels arranged for continuous broadcast coverage that framed the event as a moment of historic national liberation, with stirring music, the sound of marching feet, and commentary that consistently linked the moment to Germany's humiliation at Versailles and Hitler's personal courage in defying the Western powers. The effect on German public opinion was, by all surviving accounts, genuinely electrifying. People wept in the streets. The radio had done what thousands of pamphlets and newspaper articles had not quite managed. It had made ordinary Germans feel the event viscerally, rather than merely understanding it intellectually. Goebbels himself was a gifted radio broadcaster, though he was always somewhat in Hitler's shadow in this medium. Hitler's speeches possessed an almost physical power over German audiences that Goebbels could not replicate, and he was honest enough in his diaries to acknowledge this. His own radio style was different, tighter, faster, more ironic and argumentative, better suited to the debater's format than the revivalist preacher's approach that Hitler employed. He used radio not just for major speeches, but for more intimate addresses, what we might today call fireside chats, where he spoke to Germans in a more conversational register about current events, explaining the government's decisions, framing foreign threats, and maintaining the sense that the Nazi leadership was in direct personal communication with the ordinary German people. He was extraordinarily good at this kind of intimate persuasion, and the medium suited his particular gift for making complex political arguments feel simple, emotionally immediate, and personally relevant to each individual listener. Alongside radio, the press remained a crucial battlefield throughout the Nazi period, though Goebbels' relationship with German journalism was complicated by his genuine contempt for most journalists. He had been one himself, briefly and unhappily, and he held the profession in the kind of disdain that former insiders often reserve for their old trade. He saw most German journalists as either cowards hiding behind the cover of editorial independence or hacks who would write anything if sufficiently threatened or rewarded. The press directives he issued through the daily ministerial conference were, as a result, remarkably detailed and specific, leaving very little room for editorial judgment or initiative. The German journalist of the Nazi period was not really a journalist at all in any meaningful sense. He was a transcription service for the ministry's talking points, required to present those talking points in the format, with the emphasis, and under the headlines that the ministry specified. The result was a German press that became monotonous in its uniformity, and Goebbels was aware of this problem. He noted in his diaries with obvious frustration that German newspapers under his control were becoming dull, that the heavy hand of direction was producing a product that people were buying less and reading with less engagement. His solution, typically, was not to loosen control, but to instruct editors to be more creative within the constraints he had established, which was roughly equivalent to asking a prisoner to redecorate their cell. The foreign press was a different matter entirely, and Goebbels devoted considerable attention and resources to managing international coverage of Germany. He understood that foreign public opinion, particularly in Britain and the United States, was a strategic variable in Nazi Germany's geopolitical position. A German government that was successfully portrayed in the international press as a legitimate, stable, and even progressive state was far harder for foreign governments to isolate diplomatically or confront militarily than one universally described as a criminal regime. From 1933 to 1939, Goebbels ran a sustained campaign to shape foreign press coverage, combining selective access, social charm, outright bribery of foreign correspondents, targeted placement of stories with sympathetic foreign journalists, and the use of the 1936 Berlin Olympics as an extended international public relations exercise. The Olympics, in particular, were a triumph of image management. For 2 weeks in August 1936, the world's press corps was in Berlin, and Goebbels ran the presentation of Nazi Germany with the precision of a Hollywood studio. handling a major star. Anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed from public spaces. Particularly aggressive racial rhetoric was toned down in official discourse. The city was clean, the hotels were excellent, the sporting facilities were world-class, and the German athletes were magnificent. Many foreign correspondents went home with the impression that reports of Nazi extremism had been exaggerated, or that the movement was a transitional phase that would moderate with time. This was exactly the impression Goebbels had worked to create. But let us return to that daily schedule, because the afternoon and evening hours of Goebbels' working life also encompassed an activity that is perhaps less well understood than his media work: his role as Gauleiter of Berlin. Even after becoming Reich Minister, Goebbels retained his position as the Nazi Party's regional leader for the city of Berlin, and he took the role seriously as a parallel political power base to his ministerial authority. The Berlin Gau was not just an administrative position. It gave Goebbels direct political authority over the population of Germany's capital, authority that he used in ways that were simultaneously bureaucratic and violently coercive. He was responsible for the party's organizational activities in the city, for the management of the SA and SS formations in Berlin, for the implementation of racial laws and their enforcement, and for the political education of the city's party membership. It also gave him a platform from which to conduct the campaign of systematic harassment, exclusion, and eventually deportation of Berlin's Jewish population, which numbered approximately 160,000 people before 1933, and which Goebbels worked with particular personal enthusiasm to reduce. His hatred of Jews was, on the available evidence, entirely genuine rather than instrumentally adopted for political purposes. It was one of the deepest and most consistent elements of his personality, running through his diaries from the earliest entries and expressed in terms that are remarkable in their sheer ferocity, even within the context of Nazi leadership, where anti-Semitism was universal. Goebbels wrote about Jews with a revulsion that had the quality of a genuine phobia, using the language of disease, infestation, and contamination with a fluency that suggests the metaphors had become literally real to him rather than remaining figurative. He complained about encountering Jewish people in shops, on the street, in professional settings, with a visceral disgust that one would more commonly associate with a severe anxiety disorder than with a political ideology. Whether this ferocity had roots in specific personal experiences, in the deeply Catholic anti-Semitic environment of his Rhineland childhood, or in some more purely psychological pathology, is a question that historians have debated extensively. What is not in question is that it made him one of the most aggressive advocates within the Nazi leadership for accelerating anti-Jewish persecution, and that advocacy had consequences that reverberated across the full scale of the Holocaust. The most dramatic single illustration of Goebbels' personal role in escalating anti-Jewish violence came on November 9th and 10th, 1938, with the pogrom that became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. The immediate trigger was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst vom Rath, by a 17-year-old Polish Jewish student named Herschel Grinspan, whose parents had been deported from Germany to Poland in brutal circumstances. Vom Rath died of his wounds on November 9th, and Goebbels saw the moment with immediate political clarity as an opportunity. He was at the time at a gathering of senior Nazi leaders in Munich to commemorate the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, and that evening he delivered a speech to the assembled Nazi leadership in which he described the assassination as an outrage demanding a response, hinting broadly that if the German people chose to act against Jewish businesses and synagogues in anger, the party would not stand in the way. The speech was a signal, understood immediately by every person in the room who understood how the Nazi system worked. Within hours, SA formations and party members across Germany were receiving telephone calls instructing them to begin attacks on Jewish property. What followed across Germany and Austria on the night of November 9th and into November 10th was not a spontaneous popular uprising, despite Goebbels' subsequent insistence that it was. It was a state-organized pogrom in which approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Around 1,400 synagogues were burned or vandalized, 90 or more Jews were killed directly, and around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets of German cities were covered in broken glass from the smashed windows of Jewish shops, and the morning after, Nazi officials were already working to levy fines on the Jewish community for the property damage, a grotesque addition to the horror that had the practical function of expropriating Jewish wealth. Goebbels directed the propaganda coverage of Kristallnacht with careful attention to managing the foreign press reaction, which was immediately and overwhelmingly negative, something he had apparently not anticipated with sufficient accuracy. Even some Nazi officials expressed private reservations about the scale and visibility of the violence. But Goebbels was untroubled by these concerns and noted in his diary with evident satisfaction that a decisive step had been taken. The question that historians continue to debate about Goebbels and the Holocaust is the extent and timing of his knowledge of the systematic murder of European Jews that began in 1941 and accelerated through 1942 and 1943. The diary entries from these years contain clear evidence that Goebbels knew the broad outlines of what was happening, including explicit diary entries from March 1942, in which he describes the fate of Jews being deported to the East in terms that make his full knowledge unmistakable. He wrote on March 27, 1942, a diary entry that historians have analysed with particular intensity, describing the situation of the Jews with language that can only mean he understood they were being killed. His response to this knowledge, insofar as the diaries reveal it, was neither horror nor guilt, but rather something more like political calculation. How should this information be managed in terms of public messaging? How much could be said, and in what form, without creating unnecessary anxiety among the German population or providing usable ammunition to enemy propagandists? The Holocaust, to Goebbels, was first and foremost a communications challenge. But we must not lose sight of the more mundane daily reality of his work, because the routine management of German cultural life was itself enormously consequential in ways that extended far beyond the dramatic moments of Kristallnacht or the Total War speech. Consider what it meant for 12 years to have every book published in Germany cleared through a ministry that had demonstrably held a mass book burning on May 10, 1933, just 2 months after taking power. On that night, across German university towns, student organizations working under party direction gathered tens of thousands of books from public and university libraries, from bookshops and private collections, and burned them in public bonfires while crowds watched and professors in some cases joined the cheering. The books burned included works by Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine, Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Tucholsky, Heinrich Mann, and dozens of other major figures of European intellectual and literary life. The burning was itself a Goebbels production, staged for maximum theatrical impact, and he spoke at the main event in Berlin on Opernplatz, where around 20,000 books were consumed. The image of those fires became one of the iconic images of the Nazi period, and it was entirely his handiwork. The literature chamber of the Reich Chamber of Culture thereafter maintained a constantly updated list of forbidden books, the Liste des schädlichen und unerwünschten Schrifttums, which eventually ran to thousands of titles and was enforced by both official inspections and community denunciations. German readers who possessed forbidden books were advised to destroy them. Libraries were systematically purged. Publishers who attempted to circulate forbidden material were prosecuted. The cumulative effect was the elimination from German public discourse of an entire intellectual tradition: psychoanalysis, Marxist social theory, modernist literature, pacifist philosophy, Jewish cultural contribution, anything that challenged racial theory, undermined military values, or failed to celebrate the vision of a strong, unified, racially pure German nation. This was not a minor bureaucratic exercise. It was the deliberate intellectual impoverishment of a civilization carried out systematically, day by day, directive by directive, list entry by list entry in the afternoon working sessions of an office building in Berlin. Music was treated with particular complexity by the Goebbels apparatus because music posed problems that simpler media did not. You could ban a book or stop a newspaper from printing, but music had a way of persisting in memory and in private performance that made absolute control impossible. Goebbels' approach to music was consequently more nuanced than his approach to literature. Jazz, which had been enormously popular in Weimar Germany, was attacked as racially degenerate, a product of what the Nazi hierarchy described as African primitivism and Jewish commercialism. But jazz was so popular, particularly among young Germans, that an outright ban would have generated significant resistance, and Goebbels was acutely sensitive to the limits of what German public opinion would accept without serious friction. The solution was characteristically pragmatic. Jazz was not banned outright, but was instead subjected to a process of Aryanization, which meant that it was permissible to play music that sounded approximately like jazz as long as it was performed by German musicians, did not use the foreign term jazz, and was described in approved terms as dance or entertainment music. The actual musical content of what was broadcast and performed was often barely distinguishable from what the ideology condemned, but the theoretical framework of racial purity had been maintained. Classical music, particularly the German classical tradition from Bach through Beethoven and Brahms, was elevated to quasi-sacred status and was used extensively in public ceremonies, broadcasts and cultural events as a sonic marker of German cultural superiority. Wagner was particularly beloved, not just by Hitler, but by the entire Nazi cultural apparatus, and performances at Bayreuth, where the Wagner family maintained close ties to the Nazi leadership, received state funding and political patronage. Goebbels attended Bayreuth regularly and used the performances as social and diplomatic events. He also used them as opportunities to cultivate relationships with the artists who performed there, relationships that were simultaneously aesthetic, political, and, where female performers were involved, sometimes personal in the by now familiar predatory sense. Theatre in Nazi Germany underwent a transformation that was in some ways more subtle and in others more obvious than what happened to the press or cinema. The Weimar theatrical scene had been one of the most adventurous in the world, with Bertolt Brecht's epic theatre, expressionist drama, politically engaged performance art, and a general atmosphere of formal experimentation that was intimately connected to the left-wing, internationalist, anti-nationalist politics that Goebbels despised. By 1933, most of the major figures of Weimar theatre had either been expelled from Germany or had chosen exile. What replaced them was a theatrical culture that ranged from conventional bourgeois drama and light comedy at one end to explicitly political productions celebrating Nazi themes at the other. The Thing plays Thingspieler were an attempt to create a new form of Nazi mass theatre, performed in outdoor amphitheatres with casts of hundreds and audiences of thousands, combining elements of ancient Greek theatre with Nazi pageantry. Goebbels had mixed feelings about the Thing play movement, finding it aesthetically clunky despite his sympathy for its ideological ambitions, and it gradually declined after 1935 without his active support. What Goebbels consistently valued in theatre, as in all other cultural forms, was professionalism and quality of execution. He was genuinely impatient with ideologically correct but aesthetically second-rate work, and he said so privately with considerable frankness. He believed that Nazi Germany needed to demonstrate cultural excellence precisely because its critics claimed it had produced only barbarism, and culturally excellent propaganda was, in his view, far more persuasive than technically crude propaganda, regardless of how ideologically pure the latter might be. This conviction put him in periodic tension with more doctrinaire elements of the Nazi cultural apparatus, particularly Alfred Rosenberg's office, which was responsible for the party's ideological education program and tended to prioritize ideological content over artistic quality. The rivalry between Goebbels and Rosenberg for control of Nazi cultural policy was one of the most sustained bureaucratic conflicts of the entire Third Reich period, and it was in general a conflict that Goebbels won, because Hitler tended to side with the pragmatist over the ideologue when forced to choose. As we move into the evening hours of Goebbels' daily routine, we encounter the social dimension of his work that is perhaps the most important for understanding the cultural atmosphere of Nazi Germany. The Berlin cultural world of the 1930s operated under a system of patronage and social obligation that had the minister at its centre. Film stars, directors, theatre performers, musicians and artists attended gatherings at the ministry or at the Goebbels household with a frequency that made them, in effect, part of the regime's social infrastructure. They were not merely entertainers. They were symbols of the health and vitality of Nazi culture, living proof that Germany under National Socialism had not descended into the grey uniformity that critics predicted. Their visibility, their glamour, and their willingness to be photographed at official events provided the regime with a form of cultural legitimacy that no amount of political speechmaking could have generated. And Goebbels understood this perfectly. He cultivated performers with the attentiveness of a talent manager, protecting their careers when they needed protection, advancing them when advancement served his purposes, and reminding them when the occasion required of the exact nature of the relationship. The actress Zara Leander was perhaps the most emblematic example of this dynamic. A Swedish-born singer and actress who came to Germany in 1936, Leander was positioned by the Goebbels ministry as the replacement for the Jewish and emigrated stars who had departed German cinema. She had a remarkable voice, a dramatic screen presence, and a carefully cultivated image of romantic melancholy that proved enormously popular with German film audiences. Goebbels invested heavily in her films, giving her production support and marketing resources that rivaled anything available in Hollywood, and she became the biggest female star in wartime German cinema. The films she made, including La Habanera and Zu neuen Ufern, were not propaganda films in any crude sense. They were expensive, technically polished, emotionally sophisticated entertainments that happened to serve the ministry's strategic goal of demonstrating German cultural vitality. Leander herself was not a committed Nazi, and she eventually returned to Sweden in 1943, citing personal reasons, to Goebbels' considerable irritation. But while she was Germany's biggest star, she was a valuable asset in the ministry's cultural portfolio, and her treatment illustrated Goebbels' consistent preference for quality over ideological rigidity when quality served his strategic purposes. The male star system in Nazi cinema was equally carefully managed, with actors like Heinrich George, Emil Jannings, and Hans Albers occupying different niches in the ministry's cultural strategy. George was deployed primarily in historical and dramatic roles that gave weight and gravitas to Nazi cultural prestige. Jannings, who had been a genuine Hollywood star in the silent era and whose career had been revived by the sound film, was used in prestigious productions that demonstrated German cinema's technical and artistic quality to international audiences. Albers, enormously popular with working-class German audiences for his roles as a swaggering, good-humoured man of action, served the important function of demonstrating that Nazi Germany was not only the culture of the elite, but a popular, democratically accessible entertainment regime that knew how to have fun. Each of these careers was actively shaped by ministerial decisions about which scripts were commissioned, which directors were available, which budgets were allocated, and which promotional resources were deployed. The film that Goebbels considered his greatest propaganda achievement, and which remains the most discussed propaganda film in cinema history, was not actually made by his ministry directly. Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's documentary, record of the 1934 Nuremberg rally, was produced by Riefenstahl with direct Hitler patronage, somewhat circumventing the normal ministerial hierarchy, and this gave rise to one of the most complicated and petty rivalries of Goebbels' career. He deeply resented Riefenstahl's independent access to Hitler and her ability to operate outside his formal authority. His diary entries about her are scathing, combining professional respect for her filmmaking ability with personal contempt and resentment of her position. Yet Triumph of the Will was unquestionably a masterpiece of propaganda cinema, and its techniques, the aerial photography, the use of music, the crowd choreography, the careful construction of Hitler as a quasi-divine figure descending from the clouds to lead his people, were enormously influential on how subsequent Nazi propaganda represented political power. Goebbels may not have made it, but he studied it carefully and drew lessons from it for everything that followed. The film that Goebbels himself was most closely involved in producing, and that he considered the finest propaganda achievement of his own ministry, was the 1940 anti-Semitic feature Jude Süß. Based loosely on a historical novel about an 18th-century Jewish court financier, the film rewrote the source material to create a virulently anti-Semitic narrative that was specifically designed to prepare German and Austrian audiences for the intensification of anti-Jewish persecution. Goebbels supervised the production closely, attended screenings of rough cuts, demanded revisions, and was deeply involved in the casting and script development. The finished film was a genuine commercial success, drawing approximately 20 million viewers in Germany and German-occupied territories, and was shown to SS units prior to deportation operations with the specific intent of hardening their willingness to participate in atrocities. After the war, the film's director, Veit Harlan, was the first German filmmaker to be tried for crimes against humanity on the basis of a film. He was acquitted in 1950, a verdict that remains deeply controversial. But the chain of command for Judsus ran directly through Goebbels' office, and the film stands as perhaps the most direct and documented example of propaganda being used as a preparatory instrument for mass murder. The beginning of the Second World War in September 1939 transformed Goebbels' work in ways that he had both anticipated and, in some important respects, failed to fully prepare for. The challenge of wartime propaganda was fundamentally different from the challenge of peacetime political messaging, and the difference was essentially a problem of credibility maintenance across time. In peacetime, Goebbels had been able to manage the German information environment with considerable effectiveness because the claims his propaganda made, however distorted and selective, were at least broadly consistent with a version of observable reality. Germany was genuinely becoming more prosperous in the mid-1930s, at least for the majority of the population. The Rhineland remilitarization had genuinely been welcomed by most Germans in the region. The Anschluss with Austria had genuinely been celebrated by a significant portion of the Austrian population. The propaganda was not entirely disconnected from what people could see and feel around them, which made it far more persuasive than pure fabrication would have been. War changed this equation fundamentally. In war, the gap between propaganda claims and observable reality became both wider and more dangerous. Victories could be celebrated truthfully. Defeats had to be managed, minimized, reframed, or simply withheld from public knowledge. And the longer the war went on, the more defeats there were that required this treatment. Goebbels was aware of this structural problem from the beginning, and his approach to wartime propaganda reflected a far greater commitment to strategic truth management, finding a version of the truth that served the regime's purposes, than to outright fabrication. He believed, and stated explicitly in various internal documents and diary entries, that the most effective propaganda was broadly true in its factual content, but selectively assembled and emotionally framed to produce specific reactions in its audience. He was contemptuous of crude fabrication, partly on aesthetic grounds and partly because he understood that populations eventually discover they have been lied to, and that when they do, the resulting collapse of trust is far more damaging than any short-term benefit the lie might have produced. This approach worked brilliantly in the first 2 years of the war, which brought Germany a succession of genuine, dramatic, and easily verifiable victories. The fall of France in June 1940, accomplished in barely 6 weeks through a military campaign that stunned the world, was the greatest single propaganda gift that the war handed Goebbels, and he used it with everything he had. The newsreel coverage of the German victory parade in Paris, the footage of Hitler at the Eiffel Tower, the images of the French military leadership signing the armistice in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed its humiliation in 1918. All of this was staged, selected, and distributed by the Goebbels propaganda machine with the precision of a major studio releasing a blockbuster film. The emotional impact in Germany was overwhelming. Even people who had been skeptical of the Nazis, who had been privately worried about where Hitler's ambitions would lead, found it almost impossible to resist the sheer exhilaration of the moment. Goebbels noted in his diary with visible satisfaction that public opinion polling, which the ministry conducted through an extensive network of agents who reported on conversations overheard in shops, cafes, and public transport, showed Hitler's approval ratings at virtually 100%. The propaganda of victory was easy because the victories were real. The problem began to accumulate slowly, starting in the late summer and autumn of 1940 with the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over England and the subsequent abandonment of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was the first major German strategic setback of the war, and Goebbels managed it in characteristic fashion by changing the subject. The British bombing campaign was reframed not as a German failure to defeat British air defences, but as British terrorist bombing of German civilians, which was not entirely false in that British bombs did indeed fall on German cities, but was deeply misleading in that it ignored the context of German aggression and the fact that German bombing of British cities had preceded and provoked the British response. The framing worked reasonably well in Germany. German public opinion was genuinely outraged by British bombing and tended to view the subsequent escalation of the air war through the lens that Goebbels had provided. The Blitz on London was similarly framed, not as German atrocity, but as measured retaliation for British aggression, which was exactly the framing that served the regime's purposes, regardless of its relationship to the strategic facts. The real turning point in Goebbels' wartime propaganda challenge came with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941. In the first weeks and months, the campaign produced victories on a scale so enormous that they were almost incomprehensible, even to the German military commanders achieving them. Army Group Center advanced 600 kilometers in 2 weeks. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were taken in a series of encirclements that had no precedent in the history of warfare. The propaganda output was triumphalist and in many respects justified by the military realities. But as summer became autumn, and autumn became the most brutal winter in a generation, and as the German advance began to slow and then to stall in the frozen mud before Moscow, Goebbels faced for the first time a challenge he could not fully manage. The reality of the Russian winter and the extraordinary resilience of Soviet resistance were facts that he could not reframe into victory without losing all credibility. His response to this challenge was, characteristically, both brilliant and morally revolting. Recognizing that the German public could not be kept in indefinite ignorance of the difficulties on the Eastern Front, he decided in the winter of 1941 and 1942 to shift the emotional framework of the war rather than to insist on victory claims that nobody believed. The new narrative was one of heroic endurance rather than triumphant advance. Germany was not conquering. Germany was defending European civilization against the Bolshevik Jewish conspiracy that threatened to extinguish everything that Western culture had built. Every German soldier freezing in a dugout on the Eastern Front was, in this framework, a guardian of civilization against barbarism. Every setback was a test of German character. Every sacrifice was a contribution to the survival of the European way of life. This was not entirely a fabrication in the sense that Goebbels genuinely believed the anti-communist framework and the ideological stakes he described, but it was a fundamental reorientation of the emotional meaning of the war, accomplished with remarkable smoothness and with relatively little public resistance. The winter collections of 1941 to 1942 illustrated this approach perfectly. As the Eastern Front crisis became acute and German soldiers froze in summer uniforms because the expected quick victory had not materialized, Goebbels organized a national collection of winter clothing for troops on the Eastern Front. The Winterhilfswerk, the Winter Relief Work campaign, was framed as a great national solidarity exercise, a demonstration of the organic unity between the German home front and the fighting men at the front. Radio broadcasts appealed to Germans to donate their warm clothing for the soldiers, with emotional testimonials from soldiers' families and patriotic music carefully selected to maximize the impulse to give. The campaign was simultaneously a practical logistical effort, a propaganda triumph, and a political masterstroke, because it made every German who donated a coat or a pair of gloves a participant in the war effort with a personal investment in the outcome. Goebbels understood that people who contributed to a cause were far less likely to question its justification than people who remained passive recipients of official messaging. Throughout 1942, as German forces pushed deep into the Soviet Union in a renewed summer offensive, Goebbels maintained a careful balance between optimism about the strategic situation and realistic acknowledgement that the war was serious and demanding. He was privately more pessimistic about Germany's long-term military position than his public messaging suggested, and the diary entries from 1942 reveal a man who was performing a careful calculation of what the public could bear to hear without demoralizing collapse. He wrote with striking frankness about the gap between what he said publicly and what he believed privately, a gap that he justified to himself on the grounds that maintaining public morale was itself a strategic contribution to the war effort. If telling people a version of the truth that was more optimistic than the full truth was what was required to keep them working and fighting and believing, then that was what he would tell them, and he would not waste much energy feeling guilty about it. Then came Stalingrad. The destruction of the German Sixth Army in the winter of 1942 and 1943, the surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and more than 90,000 surviving German troops on February 2, 1943, was the catastrophe that finally broke the propaganda framework of inevitable German victory beyond any possibility of convincing repair. Goebbels had been managing the news from Stalingrad for months, first minimizing the significance of the encirclement, then framing the besieged army as heroic defenders holding the line. then in the final weeks before the surrender, promoting a narrative of the doomed but glorious last stand. When powerless surrendered, Goebbels was faced with a public relations crisis of existential proportions. He rose to meet it in what most historians consider the most brilliant and most terrible single moment of his entire propaganda career. On February 18, 1943, 12 days after the surrender at Stalingrad became public knowledge, Goebbels addressed a carefully selected audience of approximately 14,000 Nazi Party loyalists at the Berlin Sportpalast in what became known as the Total War Speech, or the Sportpalast Speech. The event was staged with extraordinary theatrical sophistication. The audience had been carefully selected to be maximally responsive and enthusiastic. Senior party officials, military officers, workers from armaments factories, wounded veterans, Nazi women's organization leaders. The hall was decorated in minimal, almost monastic fashion, with German flags and a single enormous banner reading "Total War, Shortest War." Goebbels appeared alone on a simply lit stage, without the usual trappings of Nazi visual spectacle, and delivered a speech that lasted approximately 100 minutes. What made the speech extraordinary was not its content alone, which followed predictable lines of emergency, sacrifice, and determination, but its structure. Goebbels built to a series of rhetorical questions, each one building on the previous, each one demanding a louder affirmative response from the audience. Do you want total war? Do you want it, if necessary, more total and more radical than we can even imagine today? The questions rose in intensity, and the audience's responses rose with them until the Sportpalast was reverberating with what sounded like the unanimous, ecstatic voice of the German people calling for maximum sacrifice and maximum effort. It was, as a piece of political theatre, staggeringly effective. It was broadcast live across German radio, and the experience of hearing that audience's roar reach the climactic questions, even at home through a small Volksempfänger, was almost impossible to resist emotionally. You felt the crowd's energy through the speaker. You felt swept into the collective resolve. What Goebbels knew, and what the newsreel footage confirms, was that the response was not entirely spontaneous. The audience had been briefed on the structure of the speech. Key participants had been positioned to lead the responses at critical moments. The cameras were placed to maximize the impression of unanimity and fervency. The editing of the newsreel version that was subsequently shown in cinemas across Germany further amplified this impression. The Total War speech was, in other words, a staged simulation of popular will rather than its authentic expression. But its effects in German society were real. It shifted the psychological framework from the expectation of victory to the acceptance of sacrifice. It made Goebbels himself, briefly, the most visible figure in the Nazi leadership, more visible even than Hitler, who was increasingly withdrawing from public appearances as the military situation deteriorated. And it bought the regime more time than it deserved. What is perhaps most remarkable about the period after Stalingrad is not that Goebbels managed German public opinion as well as he did, but that he was able to maintain any coherent narrative at all, given the facts that were accumulating. By the spring of 1943, Germany was fighting a two-front war against opponents whose combined resources dwarfed anything the Axis could field. The North African campaign had ended in catastrophic defeat. The Italian campaign was draining resources. The strategic bombing of German cities was intensifying, with RAF raids killing thousands of civilians and reducing major urban areas to rubble. The Kursk offensive in July 1943, Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, failed, and the German army was thereafter continuously retreating. Partisan resistance in occupied territories was escalating. Allied forces had landed in Sicily and then in Italy itself. Mussolini had fallen. Each of these developments required a new information management operation from Goebbels' ministry, and he ran them with the automatic efficiency of a machine, but the cumulative strain was visible in his diary entries, which became progressively grimmer, more self-referential, and more explicitly apocalyptic in their framing. His working day did not shorten as the war went badly. If anything, it lengthened. The bombing of German cities created an entirely new set of propaganda challenges. When a major German city was heavily bombed, the reality of the destruction could not be hidden from its inhabitants, but it could be framed. Goebbels developed sophisticated protocols for managing the aftermath of major bombing raids. First, the deaths and destruction were minimized in national reporting, with specific casualty figures rarely given, and the damage described in general terms designed to convey determined resilience rather than catastrophic loss. Second, when the destruction was simply too extensive to minimize, the emotional framing shifted to righteous anger, presenting British and later American bombing as deliberate terrorism against German civilians, a war crime that demanded retribution and steeled German resolve. Third, Goebbels himself often visited bombed cities within days of major raids, making personal appearances in the ruined streets that were covered by propaganda. Cameras and presented to the German public as evidence of the regime's solidarity with ordinary suffering Germans. These visits were genuinely dangerous and not entirely without physical courage, but they were primarily theatrical acts, calculated interventions in the public mood that served his broader strategic purposes. The visits to bombed German cities also brought Goebbels face to face with a reality that increasingly dominated the final years of his working life: the German civilians' private attitude toward the war as distinct from their public posture. He was receiving continuous intelligence reports from the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi security service's domestic intelligence arm, about what Germans were actually saying in private conversations, what jokes they were telling, what rumors they were repeating, and what their genuine level of belief in final victory actually was. These reports were frequently alarming. By 1943, and certainly by 1944, the SD reports documented widespread private skepticism about German victory, increasing circulation of defeatist humor, growing resentment at the disparity between the burdens borne by ordinary Germans and the continuing privileges of the Nazi elite, and a generalized psychological exhaustion that Goebbels recognized as a serious threat to the regime's stability. His response was to work even harder on maintaining the hope narrative, while simultaneously using the instruments of coercion to suppress public expressions of defeatism, which had by now been made a capital offense under German law. The People's Court, under the fanatical Roland Freisler, was executing ordinary Germans for defeatist remarks made in private conversations. A woman overheard saying that Germany would lose the war could be denounced to the Gestapo, arrested, tried by Freisler's kangaroo court, and guillotined. And this was not a hypothetical outcome, but something that was happening regularly by 1944. Goebbels was aware of this coercive architecture and supported it, but he was also honest enough in his private writings to recognize its limitations as a morale tool. You could frighten people into silence, but you could not frighten them into genuine hope. And it was genuine hope, not merely the absence of audible despair, that he needed to keep the German war machine functioning. His diaries from 1944 read like those of a man who has looked at the data and drawn conclusions that he cannot fully share even with himself. The entries become more mystical, more dependent on comparisons with Frederick the Great's survival of the 7 Years' War, on the possibility of a sudden reversal through a wonder weapon or a rupture in the Allied coalition, on faith in Hitler's genius transcending the merely material calculations of military power. Frederick the Great was a recurring motif in his rhetoric during this period, and it was not an accidental choice. In 1762, with Prussia seemingly destroyed and Frederick himself reportedly considering suicide, the death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth had brought a new Tsar to power, who immediately made peace with Prussia, what the Prussian court called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Goebbels believed, or professed to believe, and perhaps at some level actually did believe, that a similar miracle could save Nazi Germany. When Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Goebbels rang Hitler in the Berlin bunker with what he described as the best news of the war, convinced for a brief, extraordinary moment that the coalition arrayed against Germany would fall apart just as the 7 Years' War coalition had collapsed. The moment passed. The war continued. And the miracle did not come. But let us go back in time to the daily rhythm of his working life in 1943 and 1944, because even in these darkening years, the machinery of control continued to operate and to evolve. Goebbels was one of the Nazi leaders most committed to the use of new technologies for propaganda purposes, and the mid-war years saw significant innovations in his ministry's operational methods. The use of tactical leaflet bombing, dropping paper propaganda behind enemy lines, was supervised by his ministry. Specialized German-language broadcasts aimed at German prisoners of war in Allied captivity, at German soldiers in the field, and at populations in occupied territories were produced by dedicated units under his authority. The ministry maintained a foreign broadcasting department that produced propaganda programming in dozens of languages, attempting to sow discord among Allied populations and undermine confidence in Allied leadership. However, the effectiveness of these operations was variable and in many cases minimal, but they demonstrated Goebbels' consistent principle that propaganda was always, at every level, worth doing, that every increment of confusion or doubt created in an adversary's population was a contribution to Germany's war effort. Within Germany itself, the late-war propaganda machine shifted its focus in important ways. The imagery of inevitable victory gave way progressively to imagery of heroic defense, of sacrifice for home and family, of the terrible consequences of German defeat. This last theme, the consequences of defeat, became increasingly important in Goebbels' messaging from 1943 onward, and it represented one of his most effective long-term strategies. If Germans could be persuaded that defeat meant extermination, rape, enslavement, and the total destruction of everything they knew and valued, they would fight to the last, even when rational calculation of military odds would suggest surrender. The Morgenthau Plan, an American proposal that was briefly and unwisely publicized in September 1944, which called for the deindustrialization of post-war Germany and its reduction to an agricultural economy, was manna from heaven for Goebbels. He seized on it with both hands, broadcasting and publicizing it as proof that the Allies intended to destroy Germany as a civilization, regardless of whether ordinary Germans had anything to do with Nazi crimes. Whether or not the Morgenthau Plan was actually Allied policy, which it demonstrably was not, Goebbels used it to reinforce his core message that surrender was not an option, that for the German people it was victory or extinction, and that therefore every German had a personal stake in fighting until the last possible moment. This messaging had consequences that extended far beyond its propagandistic effect on German public morale. It contributed directly to the continuation of the war into the spring of 1945, well past any point at which German military victory was conceivably achievable, and it therefore prolonged the killing, on every front and in every camp, by months that cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives. The Holocaust continued. The bombing of German cities continued. Battles were fought for towns that had already been effectively surrounded. Soldiers who might otherwise have surrendered fought on, because they had been persuaded that surrender meant death. The propaganda of extinction, whatever its effect on German morale, was itself a weapon of mass killing, deployed by a man sitting at his desk in Berlin long after the military realities had made the outcome of the war inevitable. His personal life in these final years was shadowed by the increasing impossibility of the situation and by what appears in the diary entries to be a genuine psychological darkening. The love affair with public attention and the intoxication of power that had characterized his earlier diary entries were less evident. What replaced them was something more complex, a mixture of bitter ideological commitment, what appears to be a genuine death wish framed in heroic terms, and a strange kind of clarity about the historical moment in which he found himself. He wrote about the prospect of defeat, not with the frantic denial that characterized some of the other Nazi leaders' responses, but with a resignation that had its own kind of tragic dignity, however grotesquely misplaced. He knew by the autumn of 1944, at the very latest, that Germany was going to lose the war. He chose to continue anyway. Magda Goebbels also knew, and she had made her own decision, one that is perhaps the most terrible fact in a career full of terrible facts. She decided, and this decision appears to have been arrived at independently of her husband's wishes, that she would not allow her 6 children to survive into a world without National Socialism. She was convinced, apparently with absolute sincerity, that a world from which the Third Reich had been expelled was not a world in which her children could or should live. This decision, and the act that resulted from it in the Berlin Führerbunker on May 1st, 1945, is the single most unforgivable thing associated with the name Goebbels, in a career whose association with unforgivable acts is extensive. But before we arrive at those final terrible hours in the bunker, there is one more dimension of Goebbels' daily life and professional practice that deserves careful attention, because it represents perhaps his most original contribution to the theory and practice of political mass communication. His understanding of the relationship between entertainment and ideology, and his consistent insistence that the two were not merely compatible, but inseparable. In the Nazi system under Goebbels, the distinction between entertainment and propaganda was deliberately and systematically erased, not by making entertainment more ideological, but by making ideology more entertaining. This was the inversion that made his system so much more effective than cruder approaches, and it is the aspect of his work that has the most direct relevance to the contemporary media environment. Consider the most popular German film of the entire Nazi period, which was not Triumph of the Will or Jude Süß or any other obviously political production. It was a 1944 film called Große Freiheit No. 7, a romantic musical starring Hans Albers as a sailor who falls in love in the Hamburg Harbour district. The film is technically excellent, emotionally affecting, and contains almost no explicit political content whatsoever. It was made under Goebbels' supervision, approved by his ministry and promoted with ministry resources, and its political function was precisely its apparent political neutrality. A German population exhausted by war and bombing and deprivation went to the cinema to escape into this warm, emotional, beautifully shot entertainment, and in doing so, they were given exactly what the ministry wanted them to have: a few hours of pleasure, emotional restoration, and the implicit message that German culture was still vital, still producing beauty and warmth and joy, still worth fighting to protect. The escapism was the propaganda. The entertainment was the ideology. You could not separate them because they were the same thing. This principle extended to virtually every form of entertainment that the ministry supervised. The variety shows broadcast on German radio, with their comedians and singers and light music, served the function of maintaining emotional connection between the German people and their state-controlled media, an essential foundation for the political messaging that was embedded within them. The light comedies produced by the German film industry throughout the war years, depicting middle-class German domestic life in warm and reassuring terms, told their audiences implicitly that the world they were fighting to preserve was pleasant and normal and worth preserving. Even the sports coverage that dominated significant portions of German radio broadcasting served the function of channeling collective emotion, the shared excitement of a football match or boxing championship, into a form of national belonging that reinforced the sense of German community that was the Nazi ideology's central emotional claim. His management of German cultural life in the final war years was, in this light, not merely propaganda management, but something more like the maintenance of collective psychological health under conditions of extreme stress. He understood that populations under sustained military pressure required not only information and motivation, but emotional sustenance, pleasure, beauty, laughter, the experience of shared entertainment. A population that was denied all of these things would break down psychologically in ways that would undermine the war effort far more effectively than any amount of bad military news. So he maintained the entertainment machinery of German cultural life, even as resources became scarce and the military situation deteriorated, insisting against the objections of more doctrinaire officials that German theatres and cinemas stay open, that radio entertainment programs continue to be produced, that the basic infrastructure of cultural pleasure remain available to the German people even as their physical world was being destroyed around them. In this, he was not wrong about the psychology. He was simply applying a correct psychological insight in the service of a criminal cause. Before we reach the end in that Berlin bunker, we should spend more time with the Goebbels who existed in the years between the great propaganda triumphs and the final catastrophe, because there is a dimension of his daily life that tends to be overshadowed by the larger drama of his public role. The private intellectual who read voraciously, thought deeply about the nature of his work, and left behind, in his diaries and in the operational records of his ministry, one of the most searching self-examinations of the propagandist's craft that has ever been written. Goebbels was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, by almost any measure, remarkably intelligent, and his intelligence made his complicity in Nazi crimes not more forgivable, but in many ways more damning, because it meant he understood what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. His reading habits throughout his adult life were impressively wide and genuinely serious. He maintained a substantial personal library that covered German and European literature, classical history, contemporary philosophy, military theory, biography, and political thought. His diary entries reference specific books he was reading with the frequency and specificity of a genuinely engaged reader, rather than someone performing cultured respectability. He read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, Stendhal and Balzac. He read contemporary political theory and was well acquainted with American advertising and public relations literature, which he viewed as the most sophisticated commercial application of the principles he was applying in the political sphere. He read and reread historical accounts of past propaganda campaigns and mass persuasion efforts, including ancient examples, looking for techniques and patterns that he could apply to his own work. This was not the reading of an ideologue who used books as weapons for confirming predetermined conclusions. It was the reading of someone genuinely trying to understand how minds worked and how they could be shaped. This intellectual engagement produced, paradoxically, one of the most alarming things about Goebbels: his clarity about what he was doing. Many of the worst perpetrators of historical atrocity operated within frameworks of self-deception that allowed them to avoid fully confronting the nature of their actions. Goebbels operated within no such comfortable illusion. His diary entries contain passages that amount to explicit acknowledgements that he was systematically deceiving the German public, that the gap between what he broadcast and the truth was wide and deliberate, and that this was not a regrettable necessity, but an essential feature of effective mass political communication. He wrote about the German public with a contempt that was genuine and consistent, viewing ordinary people as a mass to be managed rather than citizens to be served, as emotional creatures whose rationality was limited and whose behavior could be reliably predicted and manipulated given sufficient understanding of their psychological patterns. This contempt was not unique to Goebbels within the Nazi leadership, but it was more explicitly theorized by him and more directly applied to his professional practice than in any comparable figure. The theoretical framework that underpinned his practice of propaganda was eclectic but coherent. He drew on Gustave Le Bon's late 19th century analysis of crowd psychology, which argued that groups lost individual rationality and became susceptible to emotional manipulation through suggestion, repetition, and leadership. He drew on Georges Sorel's theory of political myth, which argued that mass political movements were driven not by rational analysis, but by powerful motivating myths that gave meaning and direction to collective action. He drew on American advertising theory, particularly the work of Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, whose 1928 book Propaganda had laid out a theory of public opinion management that Goebbels read with evident approval. He combined these theoretical influences with his own empirical observations about what worked and what did not in the specific cultural context of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, and he built from them a practical system of mass communication that was sophisticated, adaptable, and devastatingly effective. The key principles of this system, as they can be reconstructed from his writings and from the operational record of his ministry, were roughly these. First, simplicity. Every message must be reducible to a simple, emotionally resonant core that any person of any educational level can understand and feel. Complex arguments are the enemy of effective propaganda, not because people are incapable of understanding them, but because complex arguments require active intellectual engagement, and most people in most circumstances are not in a mode of active intellectual engagement with political messaging. They are distracted, partially attentive, emotionally driven. You have a few seconds to capture their attention and perhaps a few more to plant a single idea. If your message requires more than that, you have already lost. Second, repetition. A message heard once does not become belief. A message heard 100 times coming from different directions, embedded in different contexts, associated with different emotional triggers, becomes part of the mental furniture of daily life and eventually feels like common sense, like something the listener has always known rather than something they have been told. Third, emotion before fact. The emotional case must be made before the factual case, because emotion is the door through which facts enter and become persuasive. A fact presented without an emotional framework is just a data point. The same fact presented within a powerful emotional narrative becomes conviction. Fourth, the enemy. Effective propaganda almost always requires an enemy, a clearly defined outgroup against which the in-group can define itself. The enemy must be made both threatening and contemptible, simultaneously dangerous enough to justify emergency measures and weak or evil enough to deserve defeat. The genius of Nazi propaganda was that it created an enemy, the Jewish people, who could be made to serve both functions simultaneously. Secretly powerful enough to have caused all Germany's problems, but racially inferior and morally degenerate enough to be destined for defeat and destruction. These principles were not invented by Goebbels, and he would have been the first to acknowledge that. But he applied them with a consistency, a scale, and a technical sophistication that had no precedent in the history of political communication. And the result was a demonstration of what systematic mass propaganda can do to a modern society that has been studied with appropriate horror and fascination by every communications theorist, political scientist, and student of totalitarianism in the decades since. It is important to understand that Goebbels did not work alone and was not, even at the height of his power, the sole author of the propaganda environment in which Germans lived. The system he built required thousands of willing collaborators, the journalists who followed his press directives, the radio announcers who read his approved scripts, the filmmakers who produced his approved content, the teachers who taught his approved curriculum, the party officials who repeated his approved messaging to their local populations, the SD informants who reported public opinion back up the chain. All of these people were participants in the system, some enthusiastic believers, some frightened conformists, some opportunists who saw career advancement in compliance. Goebbels understood and exploited all three types. He knew that a system that relies on true believers alone is vulnerable to changes in belief. He built a system that would function regardless of the internal states of its participants, because the incentive structures made compliance the obvious rational choice for almost everyone involved. The ministry's budget grew throughout the Nazi period as its responsibilities expanded. In 1933, it had been a relatively modest office. By the mid-1930s, it had grown into a substantial bureaucracy, employing hundreds of officials. By the war years, it was a major government department with extensive operations across occupied Europe and with budgetary resources that dwarfed most other government ministries. The financial flows through the ministry were complex and not entirely transparent, as Goebbels maintained various off-budget funds that he used for special projects, private purposes, and the maintenance of his personal lifestyle. The Bodensee estate, for example, was a city of Berlin property that had been effectively given to him for personal use through a transaction that would not have survived scrutiny under any normal governmental accounting standard. His personal expenses, including the maintenance of the estate, his household staff, his entertainment costs, and various personal expenditures that appear in the record, were largely met from ministry funds or from the party resources that he controlled as Gauleiter of Berlin. He was, in the common language of corrupt officials everywhere, helping himself to the public trough, while simultaneously producing propaganda about the selfless service of the Nazi leadership to the German people. This corruption was not unusual among the Nazi leadership. Goering's personal accumulation of art looted from Jewish collections and from occupied Europe was vastly more extensive and more grotesque. Ribbentrop and other senior officials maintained lifestyles of extraordinary luxury on public funds. Hitler himself was supported entirely by public money while maintaining the fiction of a humble servant of the people. But in Goebbels' case, the contrast between public messaging and private practice was particularly sharp because the messaging he produced was specifically about the organic unity of the Nazi leadership with ordinary German people, the shared sacrifice and common purpose that bound the Führer and his ministers to the workers and soldiers they led. The man who wrote that messaging while maintaining a lakeside estate, a cinema screening room, a fleet of official cars, a generous domestic staff, and a wardrobe that would have embarrassed a Hollywood leading man, was engaged in a hypocrisy so pure and so practiced that it had clearly ceased to register with him as hypocrisy at all. By late 1944, the geography of Goebbels' daily life had contracted significantly as the war closed in around the Reich. The Bodensee estate, while still maintained, was used less frequently as the military situation demanded his constant presence in Berlin. His ministry offices on Wilhelmplatz remained his main working space, though the building had been damaged in bombing raids and increasingly difficult conditions had reduced the efficiency of its operations. Staff had been reassigned to war-related work. Resources were constrained by the deteriorating economic situation. Foreign propaganda operations were being wound down as the territories they had targeted were liberated by Allied forces. The great machinery of cultural control was running on reduced power, its full weight no longer required in a country where the immediate priority was simply survival. On July 20th, 1944, the bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg in Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia exploded, injuring Hitler and killing 4 others. The subsequent crackdown on the military and civilian resistance networks that had organized the assassination attempt was partly supervised by Goebbels, who used it as an opportunity to advance his own influence at the expense of military figures he had long resented. Hitler's survival of the assassination attempt was presented by Goebbels as divine providence, a miraculous confirmation of the Führer's special destiny, and he worked this theme with conviction in the days and weeks that followed, though his private diary entries from the same period suggest rather less certainty about Providence's benevolence than his public messaging implied. The appointment of Joseph Goebbels as Reich Plenipotentiary for Total War in July 1944 was the culmination of an ambition he had held since the beginning of the Stalingrad crisis. He had argued repeatedly, and with considerable force, that the German war effort was being undermined by the failure of the rest of the Nazi leadership to accept the full implications of the military situation and to impose genuinely total mobilization on German society. He specifically and repeatedly criticized the continuation of civilian luxury goods production, the maintenance of domestic servants in the households of the wealthy, the continued operation of luxury restaurants and entertainment venues, and the failure to conscript women into war industries on anything like the scale employed by Britain and the Soviet Union. All of these criticisms were substantively accurate, and the resistance he encountered in making them came primarily from Göring, Speer, and others who had their own reasons for not wanting their comfortable arrangements disturbed. With the July 20th appointment, Goebbels finally had the authority to compel the kind of mobilization he had long demanded, but he was getting it at a point when the military situation had already deteriorated beyond the possibility of any mobilization saving Germany from defeat. As the Soviet armies began their final great offensives in January 1945, pushing through Poland and toward Germany's eastern border, Goebbels faced what he privately acknowledged was the end. His diary entries from this period are among the most extraordinary documents of the entire war. They alternate between episodes of almost delusional hope, fixating on the wonder weapons that were allegedly close to operational, on the possibility of a split in the Allied coalition, on Hitler's genius finding some unexpected solution, and episodes of stark, cold-eyed assessment of Germany's military and economic situation that conclude with the obvious and unanswerable truth that the war was lost. On February 3, 1945, Berlin was subjected to its heaviest single bombing raid of the war, in which over 1,000 American B-17 bombers dropped 3,000 tons of bombs on the city, killing approximately 25,000 civilians and destroying vast areas of the city centre. Goebbels' ministry building was badly damaged. His own residence near the ministry was destroyed. He moved his family, who had been in Berlin rather than the Bogensee estate, to alternative accommodation. At this point, a reasonable person might have asked what remained to be done. The Reich was contracting on every front. Allied armies were across the Rhine in the west. Soviet forces were on the Oder in the east, within 60 kilometers of Berlin. The end was a matter of weeks, not months. But Goebbels continued. He continued producing press directives, continued supervising radio broadcasts, continued managing the narrative of events with the professional thoroughness of a man who had no other identity than the one his work had given him. He was also making arrangements for the death of his family. The sequence of events in the Berlin Führer bunker in the final days of April 1945 has been reconstructed in extraordinary detail from survivor accounts, official records, and subsequent historical investigation. Hitler and his inner circle had retreated to the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in early 1945, and Goebbels was among those who chose to remain close to the Führer until the end. Magda Goebbels brought their 6 children to the bunker in late April. The children's names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heide, ranging in age from 12 to 4. They were healthy, normal children who had been raised in the strange hothouse environment of the Nazi elite, surrounded by luxury, propaganda, and the performance of happy family life, and they had no meaningful understanding of what was happening around them or of what their mother had decided. On the evening of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in Hitler's private quarters in the bunker. Earlier that day, Hitler had married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony, and he and Goebbels had spent time together in what both seemed to understand was a final conversation. The account of that conversation, reconstructed from various sources, suggests that both men were entirely clear about the situation and entirely resolved. Hitler appointed Goebbels as Reich Chancellor in his political testament and Karl Dönitz as Reich President. It was by any measure a completely fictional appointment, given that there was no longer a Reich to govern, but Goebbels appeared to find a kind of satisfaction in it nonetheless, the final acknowledgement of his indispensability. On the night of May 1st, 1945, Magda Goebbels administered a sedative to each of her 6 children individually, telling them it was medicine. Once the children were unconscious, she or an SS doctor, acting under her instruction, placed cyanide capsules in the mouths of each child and broke them. All 6 children died in their sleep. The youngest, Haida, was 4 years old. Their names to be spoken and remembered were Helga Goebbels, 12 years old, Hildegard Goebbels, 11 years old, Helmut Goebbels, 9 years old, Holdine Goebbels, 8 years old, Hedwig Goebbels, 6 years old, and Haida Goebbels, 4 years old. They were innocent children who had been given no choice in the matter, and who died because their mother could not or would not conceive of a future in which they lived in a world without the ideology that had consumed her life. This act is beyond any analytical framework. It can only be named, recorded, and mourned. Joseph Goebbels and Magda Goebbels emerged into the garden of the Reich Chancellery in the evening of May 1st, 1945. The exact sequence of events is not fully established. What is known is that both died within minutes of leaving the bunker, with gunshot wounds and cyanide poisoning. The Soviet soldiers who found their bodies on May 2nd photographed them for documentation. Both had requested in advance that their bodies be burned, in imitation of Adolf Hitler's final arrangement, but the burning was incomplete and partial, and the bodies were identified. Joseph Goebbels was 47 years old. He had been the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda for 12 years, 1 month and 19 days. What do we make of this life? It is a question that historians, philosophers, and students of political communication have been wrestling with since 1945, and it has not become easier with time. The obvious and necessary starting point is the scale of the harm. Goebbels was not directly responsible for the murder of millions of people in the same way that the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen or the administrators of the death camps were responsible. He did not personally issue orders to kill, but he constructed and maintained for 12 years the systematic deception that made those killings possible. He created the anti-Semitic hatred in German public life that provided the psychological environment within which the Holocaust could be organized, executed, and publicly accepted, or at least publicly tolerated. He maintained German commitment to a war that was lost by early 1943 and that continued for 2 more years, killing millions of additional people on every front because his work in sustaining German morale helped sustain German resistance. He was the engineer of the machine, not the machine itself, but without the engineer the machine would not have functioned, and the blood that is on the machine is therefore also on his hands. Beyond the question of his complicity in specific crimes, there is the larger question of his legacy as a practitioner of mass communication, and this is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for anyone living in the contemporary world. Goebbels was not only a war criminal, he was also, in the coldest technical sense, one of the most effective mass communicators who ever lived. The principles he articulated and applied, simplification, repetition, emotional primacy, enemy creation, the management of reality through selective presentation and framing, did not die with him in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. They are alive in every political campaign, every social media algorithm, every media ecosystem organized around emotional engagement rather than factual accuracy in the contemporary world. The techniques he pioneered or refined, targeted messaging, the manufacture of public mood, rather than its reflection, the subordination of truth to strategic narrative, the use of entertainment as a vehicle for political conditioning. All of these are now so thoroughly embedded in the practice of modern political communication that we often fail to see them as techniques at all. They have become the water in which we swim. This is not to draw a false equivalence between democratic political communication and the Nazi propaganda system. The differences are real and important. Democratic societies have independent media, freedom of expression, competitive political discourse, and legal frameworks that place limits on government speech that simply did not exist in Nazi Germany. But the techniques themselves are value neutral. They can be used in the service of lies or in the service of truth, in the service of democratic mobilization or totalitarian control, in the service of human liberation or human destruction. Goebbels understood this and said so. He was, in the privacy of his diary, entirely clear that his techniques were not specific to National Socialism, but were tools of mass persuasion that any sufficiently skilled and sufficiently ruthless communicator could use for any political purpose. This clarity, this self-awareness about the nature of his craft is one of the most chilling things about him, because it means that the lessons of his career are not simply cautionary tales about what evil looks like. They are also instruction manuals, and they have been read and applied in the decades since his death. His physical appearance remains an irony that he was well aware of in his lifetime. The man who created a racial ideology that idealized the tall, blonde, blue-eyed Nordic type was himself short, dark-haired, with a narrow face and a deformed foot, physically the opposite of everything his propaganda celebrated. He dealt with this inconsistency in various ways, by maintaining a personal appearance of the highest grooming and sartorial elegance, by projecting enormous energy and intelligence in personal interactions that overrode the physical impression, and by the sheer force of the authority that his position gave him. But the irony was noticed by his colleagues and enemies alike, and there is something telling about a man who could sustain the performance of belief in a physical ideal that he himself so obviously failed to embody. It suggests a capacity for compartmentalization, for holding contradictory realities in mind simultaneously without allowing them to interfere with each other, that was essential to everything he did, and that was, in its own way, a kind of pathological genius. The post-war period saw extensive attempts to come to terms with Goebbels as a historical figure and with the system he built. At the Nuremberg trials, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, several of his senior ministry officials were prosecuted, though most received relatively light sentences that reflected the tribunal's focus on the major war criminals and military leaders, rather than on the cultural apparatus. Goebbels himself, of course, was not present to stand trial. His ministry was formally classified as a criminal organization alongside the SS, the Gestapo, and the SD. The German film industry, press, and broadcasting system were subjected to thorough denazification processes under Allied occupation, with varying degrees of effectiveness and consistency. Many individuals who had participated enthusiastically in the Nazi cultural system were able to resume their professional careers in post-war Germany with minimal interruption, presenting themselves retrospectively as reluctant servants of the regime rather than as genuine believers. The actor Emil Jannings, who had been a prominent and apparently genuinely enthusiastic supporter of the Nazi film industry, was briefly prevented from working but subsequently resumed his career. The film director Veit Harlan, as mentioned, was acquitted of crimes against humanity. Leni Riefenstahl spent decades in legal battles over her denazification status before dying in 2003 at the age of 101, still maintaining that she had been an artist rather than a propagandist. The Goebbels diaries themselves had a remarkable post-war history. A substantial portion of the diaries survived the war in various forms, including glass plate transcriptions that had been buried for safekeeping. The Soviet forces captured large quantities of captured German records, including portions of the diaries, which remained in Soviet archives and were not made available to Western scholars until after the end of the Cold War. The full diaries were published in German in the 1990s, in a comprehensive scholarly edition, and they remain one of the most important primary sources for understanding the internal operations of the Nazi regime. Their publication renewed scholarly and public debate about Goebbels' role and significance, and the diary's own strange literary quality, the voice of a highly intelligent, morally bankrupt, self-aware monster telling his own story, has continued to fascinate and disturb readers in ways that more straightforwardly dry historical documentation does not. The Bogensee estate, Goebbels' lakeside retreat north of Berlin, had its own post-war history that is itself an almost perfect symbol of the strange way that places absorb and carry forward the legacies of their former inhabitants. After the war, the property was taken over by the East German state and converted into a school for the free German youth, the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the communist regime's version of a youth organization. Young East Germans were educated in the same buildings where Goebbels had screened films, hosted receptions, and written his diary entries about the beautiful future of the thousand-year Reich. After German reunification in 1990, the property was transferred to the state of Brandenburg, which found itself in possession of a substantial and historically significant estate that was also a monument to one of the most prolific perpetrators of mass deception in modern history. Debates about the appropriate use of the property have continued for decades, reflecting the broader German struggle with how to deal with the physical remnants of the Nazi period. The city of Berlin itself, where Goebbels served as Gauleiter for the entire Nazi period, retains in its physical fabric numerous traces of the world he helped create and then helped destroy. The ruins of the Reich Chancellery were demolished by the Soviet occupation authorities, and the site is now a residential neighbourhood with no surviving above-ground trace of the building where so much of the Third Reich's decision-making happened. The location of the Führer bunker itself, discovered during construction work in the 1990s, is marked by a small informational sign near a parking lot, an almost deliberately understated acknowledgement of what happened there. The Sportpalast, where Goebbels delivered his total war speech, was damaged in bombing raids and subsequently demolished in 1973. The sites associated with Kristallnacht across Berlin, the burned synagogues and smashed storefronts, are known and marked with memorial plaques and historical documentation, though many have been built over or otherwise lost their physical traces. What remains is the name, the record, and the unresolved questions. Joseph Goebbels was, by every measure of his own professional ambitions, enormously successful. He wanted to be famous, and he achieved a notoriety that has proven more durable than the fame of most legitimate artists and intellectuals of his era. He wanted to exercise power, and he exercised it on a scale and for a duration that dwarfs everything any of his contemporaries in cultural life could have imagined. He wanted to change history, and he did. The history he changed was not the history he intended to make, of course. He envisioned himself as a founding figure of a racial empire that would last 1,000 years and reshape European civilization, according to his Führer's vision. What he actually helped create was a cautionary tale so extreme that it became the defining moral reference point of the 20th century, the event against which all other political violence and all other propaganda and all other political manipulation is measured. In that sense, his most enduring legacy is not what he built, but what he destroyed. Not the Third Reich, which lasted 12 years, but the comforting belief that mass democratic societies are naturally immune to organized deception and systematic hatred. A belief that his career proved decisively and irreversibly to be false. The question of what he did all day has an answer that is both mundane and monstrous. He woke up, reviewed his reports, directed his press conferences, screened his films, attended his meetings, wrote his diary, went to his social engagements, pursued his personal obsessions, managed his political relationships, and went to sleep. He did this every day with the regularity and professionalism of a highly effective executive running a large and complex organization. And the organization he was running was dedicated to the systematic destruction of truth, the cultivation of hatred, and the psychological preparation of a civilization for genocide. The banality of his daily routine makes the evil of his work neither more nor less terrible than it would otherwise be. But it does remind us of something important, that the machinery of mass deception does not operate through dramatic, identifiable acts of villainy. It operates through daily routines, regular meetings, management decisions, staffing choices, budget allocations, and the accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions that individually seem unremarkable and that collectively constitute one of the most catastrophic projects in the history of human communication. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most influential and most dangerous figures, both educational and thought-provoking, make sure to check out our other videos on the key figures of the Nazi period and the Second World War. There is so much more to explore in this history, from the other ministers who ran Hitler's regime to the soldiers, civilians, and resistors who experienced it from every possible angle. Do not forget to like this video if you learned something new today, subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the history that made the modern world. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you in the next one.